Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the 12th installment of Encyclopedia Hermetica, a big history. Today we are going to discuss Roman history, specifically very early Roman history, which stretches back into a near mythical period. This is the history which coincides with our period, which we're discussing at the moment, the 8th century, the 7th century, the 6th century. We have a very special guest with us on the show today, Brett Bartlett from the University of Waterloo. He is a master's candidate there. His specialties are Latin oratory and Greek and Latin philology. He's going to help me navigate the maze that is early Roman history. Now, my talk with him was recorded at another date, and unfortunately the first 18 minutes of our talk has gone missing, so I'm going to do my best to try and fill in what we were discussing. We were talking about the Etruscans, who are a people who resided in the area which would eventually become Roman territory once the Latins knocked the Etruscans out of power. The Etruscans were once believed to be a linguistic isolate. This is something we discussed. And lately it's been postulated that they have parallels in their language with the people of the Greek island of Lemnos. These are called the Lemnians. Now, either the Etruscans have some sort of influence on the Lemnians, or vice versa. The Etruscans did have access to the sea, but we really don't know which way the influence flowed. So, for centuries before cities had been formed, Italy was a land essentially of villages. Urban life appeared much later than it had in other portions of the Mediterranean basin. Over time, small settlements slowly became larger and more complex on a social, economic, and political level, and their leaders fought to build connections in the wider Mediterranean world, which one day Rome would come to dominate. The Romans called the Mediterranean Sea Mare Nostrum, our sea, our pond, essentially, because they wrapped themselves around the entire Mediterranean and controlled the whole sea to themselves. But in the 7th and the 6th centuries BC, some of these small rural villages began to achieve the status of cities, and they built monuments, they built temples, they had formal public spaces, and other small settlements would follow in later centuries and begin to amalgamate. So agriculture appeared in Italy around 4000 BC. Settlements were very small. Usually there were no more than a few huts or buildings for each village. Most villages comprised less than 100 inhabitants. They planted barley and wheat. They raised sheep, goats, cattle, pigs. They had very simple technology, and there were very few signs of occupational specialization. Most tools that were used were made of wood, bone, or stone. Like with most places, the use of metals provided clear examples of more sophisticated techniques and specializations in crafts. It was around 2000 that copper tools and ornaments appeared in the material record. It was very limited bronze in Italy. Most Italian metallurgy shows influence from outside the peninsula. In Italy, Mycenaean merchants had long been active along the southern half of the Adriatic shore. That's the eastern coast of Italy. They also traded extensively along the southern coast of the peninsula and the west coast as far north as the Bay of Naples. Central Italy was not really affected by these Mycenaean trade movements. So, beginning in about the 9th century, there occurred a number of developments in Italy which, by the 7th century, led to the appearance of cities that would turn out to dominate Italian history. Obviously, we call this period the Iron Age. This is what we've been talking about for the last little while. So in the 9th and 8th centuries, Etruria, Latium, Latium is how it's spelled, and Campania saw the rise of an interrelated group of cultures that would eventually develop into major centers of power. In Etruria, the Iron Age culture of these centuries is called the Villanovan culture. This name was derived from an estate near modern Bologna where archaeologists first found traces of its material culture. So one of the main traits of Villanovan culture was the greatly increased size of settlements. So there were over 1,000 inhabitants in these settlements as opposed to the sparsely populated villages. As far as internal organization was concerned, these new and larger settlements were relatively simple. They consisted of clusters of huts, and there were no elaborate social systems. There was no clearly identifiable distinctions in wealth. There were no formal layouts, such as the grid system we are so familiar with today. And there were no public buildings. So between Villanovan, Etruria, and Campania, Latium developed its own regional culture around the year 1000. And there were smaller settlements located on the hills that projected from the Apennines into the plains. In the late 9th century, as well as the 8th, maritime contact with the Eastern Mediterranean became a prominent factor in the development of Central Italian society. The Phoenicians led the way. They came from the coastal regions of the modern states of Syria and Lebanon in the eastern shores of the Mediterranean. And around 1000, the leaders of some of these cities, especially Tyre and Sidon, began to send out settlers and trading expeditions, first to the nearby coasts of Cyprus, which were very rich in copper, but also as far away as Spain. Eventually, Phoenician settlers would establish a series of new cities along the coasts of western Sicily, Sardinia, North Africa, and southern Spain. Carthage, which was probably founded around the year 800 in the territory of modern Tunisia, would become one of the most powerful of these new settlements, and Rome's greatest rival. The Greeks arrived shortly after the Phoenicians. Following the collapse of the Mycenaean civilization during the 12th century, contacts between Italy and the Greek world had declined rapidly. So by the period we are talking about, the Italian world, especially its southern portion, was dotted by Greek and Phoenician settlements. These would interact with the Latin world extensively. until they would be absorbed into the wider Roman world at a much later date. So, beginning in the middle of the 8th century, and then continuing over, let's say, the next 3 centuries, Etruria, Latium, and Campania witnessed a series of political, social, and cultural innovations. These resulted in the formation of the first Italian city-states. The appearance of this new form of political life, the life of the polis, was a broad phenomenon, and it was characterized by many regions and ethnic groups. So in Italy, city-states became the dominant form of organization in Etruria, in Latium, in Campania, and in the Greek regions of Sicily and southern Italy. So a city-state is both a type of settlement and a form of political, military, and social organization. Fully developed city-states tend to possess a clearly defined urban core with special areas designated for elite and communal ends, along with cemeteries encircling it. Outside of the polis walls are usually scattered shrines, farmlands, sacred groves. The scale of these city-states could vary greatly. In the Greek world, which was much larger at the time, a typical polis could have about 1,000 inhabitants and cover a territory of around 100 square kilometers. Its army would have numbered no more than a few hundred men. In central Italy, however, many of the emerging city-states would have been somewhat larger than this, and by the end of the 6th century, some populations had swelled to several tens of thousands. Aristocratic families and their dependents through the client system dominated most emerging city-states. In the 7th and 6th centuries, kings reigned in some of these city-states. By the early 5th century, certain cities possessed formal offices and priesthoods, and these were filled by a process of election, a rigged election, but an election no less, and they held for terms of about a year. These kinds of arrangements eventually became standard procedure. So scholars divide the formative age of the city-state into 2 broad phases. We've got the Orientalizing period, which is circa 725 to 580 BC, and then we've got the Archaic period, which is 580 to 480 BC. We aren't going to discuss the Archaic period in much detail, since that lies outside of our scope for the time being. So, beginning in the late 8th century, a number of communities in southern Etruria began to develop rapidly into city-states. By the end of the 7th century, we could find others in northern Etruria, as well as inland in the valleys of the Tiber and the Arno rivers. So these cities all possessed a common language, Etruscan, and many features of their government, social organization, and religion were similar to one another. You might sometimes hear it said that there was a league of 10 cities in Etruria. This is probably not true. Etruscan city-states were never united politically, and frequently they were rivals with one another and often even enemies. So I'm going to switch to my talk with Brett. We're going to jump in medias res, in the middle of things, and take off with our conversation about Etruscan religion and move from there. Right, so Etruscan religion. So we don't know about the Vestal virgins, whether they're Etruscan or not, but the building is.
I was reading on Livy which king instituted it, and I'd forgotten already. It was either Ancus Marcius or Numa Pompilius.
Okay.
But that's just...
Yeah,
I'll get into that when we get to the kings.
We're in Mythland there.
When we start discussing the kings, I can discuss that.
Yeah.
For the most part, the Roman historical tradition, and this has no basis. The problem with Roman historical tradition is that the earliest we get is the late 3rd century traditions, the annals of Quintus Fabius Pictor, and it's largely
we don't have them anymore.
They're not only are they fragmentary or they're just quote cited indirectly, but he invented. We don't know how much he invented, but he had to have invented wholesale.
Yeah, that was after the sack of Rome by the Gauls. Everything was destroyed.
And what would there have been anyway? They had no literature at the moment. They had names on a board. How do they know the stories for each of these?
Now, what date was that? 390
or 389.
Okay, good. Yeah, that's far ahead of where we're at.
Yes.
But important nonetheless.
We'll probably move a little past what's called the Regifugium, the Flight of the Kings.
Yes.
Because that might not be the end of a king.
Yeah, exactly. So, we have the Penates and the Lares.
Yes.
We have the Numen. The Numen were, let's say, little gods of individualized parts. I almost like to think of these more as like divine words than anything. But they're spirits that inhabit trees and rivers and rocks and door thresholds and door handles and door frames and doors themselves. And every single little thing has its own numen to which you have to be propitious. And,
to which you have to be propitious. That just reminds me of the ritual for sacrificing an oxen. An oxen, that's grammatically incorrect. An ox. That you have to get the cattle to nod as if it assents to its own sacrifice.
Oh, yeah. Well, and nuo is one of the...
Numen, yes.
Yeah, one of the most important...
It's the result of a nod being made.
Yep. The
English,
divine nod.
I like the idea of it being a verbal noun, that has the idea of something being done. God is generally agreed to be a past participle in an origin.
Having been nodded?
Oh, God is not a nod, but he is the result of a libation or a summons.
Interesting.
Depending on how you
So it's
derive
one for whom libations have been poured?
Yes, or if it can be that anthropomorphized.
Right.
It's just the perfect passive participle of...
Libationed.
Yeah, poured.
Interesting.
And, God before the Germans were Christianized was a neuter, just as Numen is.
Right.
So that's why goddess has that S that we got from French, not some earlier Germanic feminine.
Right.
There was no idea of a feminine god because there's no masculine god.
So we also have the Penates, who are the household gods.
Yes, and they are definitely an Italic tradition, despite what Virgil may say.
Yes.
Who has Aeneas carrying the
Bring
Penate.
them in from Troy.
Yeah.
Yeah, with his father on his back, away from the burning ruins.
Fuck my wife. Yeah. Yeah, he just abandons his wife. He finds out she died. Alright, gotta go.
Yep.
And he may have brought a child with him, depending on who you ask.
But at least you have the household gods.
Yeah.
I always find it funny, people who, talk so much about, king and country, but don't even care about their own. They,
That's a
stick
very
their old
common...
people in homes.
Oh, we could talk about we could talk about Marcus Horatius today. One of those very early figures of the inception of the Republic. When we get to that, when it comes to the Roman tradition of putting country before family, very valued virtue.
Ugh.
It's part of my alliteration, or was it more of the philosophical grounds that made you cringe?
Yeah, it was that. How sweet to die for my country.
It's king and country, or lord and land, but why never land and lady?
I live for my land and my lady. It seems here you be trespassing. Okay, so then let's talk about the tradition that is very strong with the Etruscans, and over time would not become so hot with the Romans, which is kingship.
Oh, yes, all the Etruscans had kings, from what we know, or some chieftain, whatever they called them. Mm-hmm. Sometimes various cities would be under one, sometimes it'd be just by themselves. The idea of a 10-city Etruscan league is a retrojection by later historians who didn't understand the nuances of the period. They just assumed that the Etruscans were of a league of some sort.
Yeah.
I forget what number the Romans attributed this 10 to, contributing to. If it was perhaps a priesthood or something. I forget.
I don't know. I just know that 15 is the magical priest number in Rome. The quindecimviri.
Oh. Yes. I didn't even know what quindecimviri. Politics, you know.
Yeah. It's just like, that's the priesthood to whom you have to get all your cults officiated by in order to, like...
This would have something to do with the Bacchanalia, I guess.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. It's like, oh, well, this cult has been banned by the quindecimviri because, like, they're strange Eastern madness-inducing nonsense cults, and we've got no place for that in good old Stoic Rome.
Except for, well, they're Stoic in many of their ideals, but not in name. Since they've ejected them from the city a few times.
Right. That's probably just more because they were like dicks as people.
Have you read Lucan?
He's a jerk.
The guy is more pessimistic than I am.
I don't know about that.
Have you read Lucan?
Yeah, dude, I gave a talk about Lucan.
Excellent.
Yeah. I think that he's not necessarily pessimistic. I think he's a realist.
That's what pessimists say to defend themselves.
I know. And that's what I'm going to say to defend Lucan.
All right, I guess a realist has shown his colors.
Lucan's pessimism is pretty much the same as my own. It's just like, look at all this like madness that these ambitious men have wrought upon the world, and all the like death that it follows in their wake.
One thing I always liked about Lucan was the absence of gods in an epic. Completely unthinkable.
But he elevates men to the status of gods.
A few.
Yes, but
Cato.
There's very godlike.
That march to the desert where everyone's getting eaten by snakes and poisoned, and Cato doesn't care. No. We keep marching.
My favorite scene is the felling of the grove.
Oh yeah, to build more war boats. I like that because usually in epic you fell a grove to burn the dead.
The deity.
Well, the idea is usually you cut down a forest in epic when you're going to have a massive burial, and not burial, but a lot of fires for the dead, pyres, and they just want to talk about the scale of the dead, so they need to cut down a whole forest.
Yeah.
And this one's, they're cutting down the sacred grove just to wage war.
Yeah, essentially. Well, it's also like a way to show Caesar's hubris.
Yeah.
And like, he's just like, I am more triumphant than all the gods. I just fucking savaged their groves, and like, I don't care. Nobody stops me. That's what I mean by Lucan elevating these men to godhood. But in any case, speaking of men elevated to godhood, let's get back to our Etruscan kings.
Well, only a couple of them have become gods.
True.
And even that's questionable. Like,
yeah.
There's a question. Well, we can. Where do you want to start with the kings? Do you want to go to the Aeneas tradition for the beginning of Rome to start with, or do you want to?
Yeah, we could do that, and then so something that probably needs to be said is that when we go this far back into history, there is a tremendous amount of myth
helixed in with the truth.
I'd say this is more myth than truth at any degree.
Right.
So for the myth,
But it does represent the Bronze Age collapse, the sack of Troy, and the flight of the Trojans, the great diaspora that they experience.
But we're about to get into epic time, because we have the 12th century collapse of Troy, and the ancients put it at what, like 1115 for the Trojan War?
Something like that.
1150, 12th century.
All right. So that's where the traditional historians put it. So the Romans would have considered it happening, well, Virgil would have considered it happening about 1100 years prior to his own life.
Mm-hmm.
And then as Aeneas, a Trojan general and son of Venus, flees westward.
Oh, yes, it's a good way to tie Augustus to a divine ancestry.
Yes, he flees westward with his son Iulus, for whom the Julians, the Iulii, claim descent.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Iulus disappears in Livy, so he gets one brief mention of possibly existing. But Iulus, or Julius, or Ascanius, as he's also known. I'm going to call him Ascanius because I like pronouncing it more.
Yeah.
So, henceforth, Ascanius.
It's what he is in Virgil.
They depart from Troy, and Aeneas, son, father, dead, the mother left behind, she's dead, his wife, she's dead. They go westward, and for 10 years, they traveled westward and wandered, much like Odysseus, for 10 years, and having left Troy in the mid-12th century, apparently arrived in the mid-9th century to find Carthage being founded, which the Romans would have recognized, but they didn't care, because epic time is not...
Right. It's in illo tempore.
Yeah.
It's this great confoundment of times where everything kind of happens as a big four-dimensional object rather than a flow. Right.
Yeah, so anyway, Aeneas spends some time there, alienates Dido, she kills herself, and there's enmity forever towards his progeny and the sons of Carthage.
Yep.
And then he goes, eventually, to Italy, and fights a little, establishes some land, and that is Virgil's epic. That has 100 years, roughly, prior to the founding of Rome, the arrival of Aeneas and the Trojan refugees in Italy.
Yes. So, Aeneas was thought to have founded the people of Rome, whereas Romulus and Remus now, with our traditional founding date in 753, they found the city itself of Rome.
This is the founding of the people versus founding of the city. This is
a false dichotomy because they intermarry.
No, the problem with it is it shows two different traditions of the founding of the city trying to be reconciled.
Correct.
So there's one tradition that has Aeneas founding the city, and another that has Romulus and Remus. All right, so they just throw the one back further, and the problem here is also that for the Virgil story to work, Aeneas founds it 300 to 400 years too late.
Well, the idea, that's what I mean by the people. They dwell in the land for some time.
Yeah, don't forget, Ascanius is responsible for Alba Longa.
Well,
the city Alba Longa.
Yeah. Yes, Ascanius is, and I was going to get to that, because it goes from Lavinium to Alba Longa to Rome, and what I'm saying is that the Aeneas myth was originally started off as Aeneas being the founder of Rome. That's the earliest story that we have evidence of. Then it moves to Aeneas being the founder of the patriarch of the Latin people in Italy, whose descendants found Rome. What we have now with the founding of Lavinium, then Alba Longa, and Rome is just trying to reconcile two contrary myths.
Correct.
So Ascanius now founds Alba Longa. Now, whether he's the son of Creusa, dead woman in Troy, or Lavinia, Latinus's daughter, Livy doesn't know. No one can say for certain. Livy prefers ignoring the Virgil tradition, which is just something contemporaries do at that time.
Mm-hmm.
So we have the foundation of Alba Longa by Ascanius once he comes of age, and then he has a bunch of descendants who succeed in one fashion or another. We have the Tiber, for example, being named after one who a Tiberius who drowned in it. Whereas if you think about it, Tiberius or Tiberius, which one sounds like it's derived from the other? Would Tiberius give his name to the Tiber?
Yeah.
Or would the Tiber
The
give
us sounds like it would be more likely to be tacked on to the Tiger. The Tiber.
Yeah. So what happened was, we now have someone who got their name from the river in history giving their name to the river.
Yeah, they're retro-projecting.
And a great example of this is all the people who think that Rome is derived from Romulus, which is the Roman tradition, and not the other way around.
Right. Speaking of which, let's talk about Romulus and Remus, because that's probably where we need to start in order to get in our discussion about kings.
All right.
So
eventually we come to a pair of brothers, and
sons of Mars.
not yet.
Mm.
We're going to get to just mention Numitor and Amulius,
Okay, good.
the brothers who Numitor should have been the king.
He's the evil stepfather in the myth, is he not?
I believe he's the older one who should have been king but was pushed out by Amulius.
Okay.
I could have it in the wrong order.
Right. This is a very, fairy tale story, so
Yes.
it has a lot of,
I love this
elements of
story. It
fairy
has the
tale.
wolf.
Yeah,
That
it does.
goddamn wolf.
The one who blows the house down and eats
No.
Little Red Riding Hood.
Little Red Romulus Hood.
So, Numitor is expelled by Amulius, his son killed, and his daughter made into a Vestal Virgin.
Mm.
Oh yes, that was
The
already
institution is in place.
that was already there. Yes,
All right.
I like that. I just thought of that. Pushed out, his daughter made a Vestal Virgin, and all of a sudden, she becomes pregnant. And now I love Livy here. Livy's place in this story is great. He's a euhemerist. Do you know what?
Yeah, it's like making people divine
Euhemerism is
in the past.
yeah, he looks at all myth as being just exaggerations.
Yeah, it's like saying, if Jesus was, just a man, and now we have euhemerized him.
Yes, exactly. It's a
I believe the opposite, by the way.
But anyway, euhemerism was huge. Thucydides did it very commonly with myth, epic. Euhemerism's the person for whom it's named came 100 years after Thucydides, but he wrote a philosophy about it and how he believed that all myth is just derived from embellished facts.
It's a very Egyptian and Thracian tradition, and Eastern as well. So
Well, but
it's very popular.
But anyway, so Livy says that the daughter of Numitor claimed that Mars was the father, and he says she may have claimed this because it was true, or simply because it seemed more honest. That is, more respectable.
Yeah. Well, and, when you are sons of a certain deity like that, often this has astrological, calendrical implications as to which month or which time someone was born under. And this is something people often overlook. If you're a son of Mars, it could be that you were, maybe born in March or something, but that's obviously anachronistic.
But yes, the idea here is simply that Livy thinks that she might have claimed this, but it might be true, or it might just be made up. He constantly does this with mythical origins, and he believes, in his preface, he states that it's the right of the conqueror to make up for themselves their own story. Very nice of him, but
At least he tells you.
yeah, it's
honest.
It's honest, but anyway, she gets impregnated by Mars, let's say. And then she bears two children who get exposed in a little basket or tub by the Tiber, and it just so happened that the guy who was exposing them couldn't actually reach the flow because it was flooding at that time of year. So who knows? It could have been March.
Yeah, it's another child in the wicker basket in the river motif
Yeah.
that goes back to Sargon the Great.
And so we have them being exposed and then being nursed, eventually being carried by a gentle stream to a place where they hit firm land and the water would recede. And then a wolf in the mountain heard their crying and came down and offered her breasts to the babies to suckle. And then a farmer came and like, I'm going to take these babies home for my wife to raise them.
Another great folk motif.
Yes. And now there are some who believe, as Livy states, that it wasn't actually a she-wolf that nursed the babies, but that the farmer's wife, on account of the prostitution of her body, was called a she-wolf by the locals. And this is euhemerizing again, and I love it.
Awesome. What is it, like Lupina or
Lupa.
something? Lupa.
And in earlier stories,
a ravenous woman.
In earlier stories, it's just a lupus, but given feminine endings.
Nice.
Because it goes to show how the idea of making an animal feminine was rather novel to Latin even in the 3rd century BC.
Ooh, that's very interesting.
The common gender has some very strong branches that took a while to die out.
Cool. Okay, so we've got Romulus and Remus being taken into the farmer's household, and the Lupa.
Perhaps they already got nourished by the wolf, and now she was just teaching them.
It's like the Jungle Book.
But yeah, I like the idea that there was a 3rd child there that she was still breastfeeding, who just doesn't get mentioned in this story. The euhemerizing tradition neglects much. Then again, I guess the she-wolf's neglecting her young. If
Right.
It's the Brian of the situation.
But anyway, they come of age, stuff happens, and they restore Numitor to the throne after a bunch of, there were some trinkets recognized, and Numitor was like, ooh, I know you're a twin who's that old. You don't say. We don't get many of them in our sparsely populated village.
That's true.
So they go to found a city. And
the city they found?
Well, it was either going to be Rama or Roma.
And now, tell me, why was it now Roma and not Rama?
Well, according to Livy and the tradition, they came to argue about who should be the one who gives their name to the hill. So, as the historian who was taking notes on the side of the hills of Rome that day, that early April day in 753, the scribe noted that Remus took the Aventine Hill, and Romulus took the Capitoline, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
And they decided to decide the matter with auguries, so bird sightings. And so Remus sets out his little templum,
His little area of the sky.
that has to get birds, and he gets 6 birds almost instantly. And so, obviously his founder's thinking, the birds have spoken. And then Romulus's birds come later thinking, no, there's more of us. That he gets 12. And now apparently a fight breaks out, and they kill each other. Well, not each other. Well, the supporters kill each other, but
Right.
Romulus strikes Remus, kills him, and it's
And
Rome.
then builds the walls.
Yeah.
Or
There's the other story.
the other story, obviously, is that they were in the process of building a wall, and Romulus jumped over the...
Remus jumped over Romulus.
Remus jumped over the portion of Romulus's wall, which insulted Romulus, obviously, so he just killed him. It was very, Cain and Abel type story.
Yes. There are 2. Livy reports both. I gave preference to the one he preferred.
Yeah.
Well, I guess one kind of is a little less childish than the other.
I don't know. I think the one says a lot about the concept of walls in that specific time.
He transgressed a boundary.
Yeah, the Pomerium was the sacred precinct of a city, and that is the holy of holies from within which the entire city is generated. So to transgress that is like, I don't know, it's leftover monkey shit.
Well, I think the preference for Livy is he wants to trace the origins of corruption in Rome.
Yeah.
And he's coming out of a period of many civil wars, and so he wants to look at the fratricidal element and people turning against each other.
Right.
And that is...
To give sense to the civil wars of the first century.
Yes, because Livy's goal is to trace the corruption. He disagrees strongly with Sallust, and he makes it clear in his preface by wording himself quite oppositely. And while he sees Rome as degrading over time, he sees moments as just omens of things to come.
Mm-hmm.
And yes, that would be an ill omen that inaugurated the city of Rome.
Yeah. And this would repeat fractally throughout the
Yes.
hallways of history. So then let's talk about corruption and the kings, and why were the kings eventually driven out and the republic established.
Well, if you want to talk about the kings being driven out, you pretty much have to ignore the first four kings.
Yeah.
Well, the mythological kings.
Well, let's say a little bit about that.
All right. Well, first, there are, from 753 to 509, there is one of the most stable reigns any country has ever seen, with only 7 kings. That sounds almost fictitious.
Yeah. I mean, it's like they must have had a real iron fist, or...
And healthy. Oh,
Yeah.
so healthy.
Good food, I guess.
Yes.
All
They
of
lived like kings.
the Mediterranean diet, right.
Well, it's generally believed that the number of kings we've gotten fits just a thematic theme where we have war wager versus a public servant, then another. And while they all may wage war, Numa Pompilius, the second king, will not be an aggressor. Ancus Marcius will not be an aggressor. Tullius Servius. It's the Servius.
Yeah,
that's
it's a
right.
Servian wall. So.
Okay.
Tullius. I was mistaking that in Tullius Hostilius.
Yeah.
Tullius Servius. So Numa Pompilius, Ancus Marcius, and Tullius Servius are all peaceful, religiously minded domestic issues, whereas Romulus, Tullus Hostilius, Lucius Tarquinius Priscus, and Lucius Tarquinius Superbus are all warmongers.
Yes. Under whom did the rape of the Sabine women occur?
That's Romulus.
Right, so let's talk about this. I mean, I like to talk about how the founding of Rome was based on fratricidal rapists.
Well, first of all,
That didn't
rape
change.
doesn't... While rape most definitely did occur,
I mean, rapists...
if the story happened, it would have to have...
I mean, rapists in the purely etymological sense of the
Yes,
word.
stealers.
Yeah. Like
rape.
snatchers.
Yes. Rape means from rapio to steal, and
Yeah.
the Romans, having this problem where they let in a bunch of men, well, Romulus, realizing that he only has men there, realized that the greatness of his new city that had built up so quickly would perish within a lifetime if he can't get
Procure
young.
some women.
So he tried to acquire marriage rights with the neighbors, a few Latin...
Problem in the New World.
Yeah. A few Latin territories or similar, and the Sabines who spoke Faliscan. But anyway, so a handful of these tribes they invite to a game after failing to acquire marriage rights, and while everyone was watching the games and having fun, a bunch of Roman youths came out and just grabbed up all the virgins. Or what they assumed to be virgins, I should say.
Snatching your people up.
Yes. Hide your wives, hide your kids.
Or else we'll hide them.
And anyway, the parents fled angry, and they all piecemeal waged war on the Romans.
And then they were persuaded that things were okay, and they lived happily ever after.
Exactly.
The women themselves stopped them from fighting and said, we'll just hang out with the Romans.
After the Fourth War.
Yeah.
The first three, they tore the battle between... Well, most of the women were Sabines, so...
They settled.
Yeah, they're like, come on, Bro, so, come on, hubby, don't kill my dad. Which is something in my upbringing you hear all too often.
Okay, so we have the 4 or 5 initial kings, and now we're getting well beyond our time scope, but we won't press on too far after that bracket of 506, because we haven't even really spoken about Athens yet.
Yes.
So what happens with this expulsion of the kings?
Okay, at the expulsion of the kings, there were a few kings, all for the more or less Etruscan, and the last one, Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, he ruled cruelly, and apparently the people had enough and kicked him out. That we know. It's called the Regifugium, or the Regifugium, depending on how you pronounce it, and it took place roughly 509. Now the problem with this, there are a couple stories now that need not be taken together that both explain it. The one is the story of Brutus, being the one who expelled Marcus Junius Brutus, being the one who expelled the kings.
Tarquinius Superbus?
Yes.
Yeah.
And that is when both of Tarquinius' sons...
Yeah, he's sometimes called Tarquin the Proud.
Yeah,
Or the Haughty.
Tarquinius Superbus.
Yeah.
Tarquin the Proud, both of his sons went off to Delphi to see who would succeed. They were on another mission, but they asked who was going to succeed when it's there, and they took Brutus along with them. Brutus, up to this point, as the story has it, this is a great folk etymology, his parents were killed at a young age, when he was young, by King Tarquinius Superbus, so fearing that they would kill him too, he played the idiot, and they just left him alone, so he'd always stutter and say stupid things. But inside there was someone cunning, apparently. Livy compared him to the staff that he carried that was a piece of wood that was around a bunch of gold. That was his walking stick, because he was a stupid thing on the outside, but really clever. So when they asked who would succeed, the Oracle of Delphi said, whoever of you kisses your mother first. So the two brothers race out of Delphi trying to figure out how they're going to beat the other one home. And Brutus pretends to stumble, and when he hits the ground, he kisses the earth. And that is how the next ruler was decided. And when they return home, they find the city in disarray, and Brutus raises a popular group against the kings and takes over. That's one of the stories that we find present in Livy that has been adapted to fit the Lucretia story.
Okay. And does he prefer this one?
When I say one of the stories, these are Livy packs two stories together and makes Brutus part of the Lucretia one.
He pulled an Old Testament or a Genesis.
It was Wiseman's article on this. It's a couple decades old now, where he talks about how a few of these stories that are all woven into the narrative together can be taken separately on their own. So Brutus does not need to be part of the Lucretia narrative.
Okay.
Because he somehow conveniently manages to be present at Lucretia's death too, because, when your wife calls for you in an emergency, you bring the town retard with you.
So let's talk about this rape of Lucretia story.
Alright, so Lucretia was the wife of Collatinus, part of the Etruscan nobility, despite the fact he has Latinus right in his name. And, his name was taken from, I believe, a position he held in Collatina or something, so just a Latin colony. But anyway, Collatinus, husband of Lucretia, had a wager, according to Livy, with a bunch of the guys, including Sextus Tarquinius, the son of Tarquin the Proud, or Haughty. And anyway, they all wagered whose wives were the hottest, because that is what men do.
Right.
So they all ride around that night, going from place to place on this wager to see whose is the hottest. And they find their wives having fun and socializing. And then eventually they come to Collatinus's place.
And she is dutifully
weaving or spinning yarn, yes.
Yeah.
As a side note, whenever a woman's doing anything with yarn, it means that she's chaste.
Yeah.
That's just, it works, and it's modern too. So the Theocritus poem Distaff the frame is, this is for my friend's wife. It's a distaff, something for
weaving.
Something for weaving.
Yeah.
That has the subtext of, get back to womanly duties,
Yep.
you're being a whore.
I talked earlier on the show about how the loom was used as the chief weapon of the patriarchy to keep women's hands tied.
I
literally.
just watched a film adaptation of a Hamlet recently,
nice.
and the one thing I just picked up because of my classics degree now is not only the "get thee to a nunnery," which Hamlet says, but the next thing the poor woman hears is Polonius, the father of Ophelia, telling her that she should get back to her embroidery. And I'm just like, oh, this poor woman just got called a whore by her father and her lover tonight. No wonder she commits suicide after one of them dies. What would you think if you're in all this turmoil, your dad calls you a whore, then gets murdered by the other guy who called you a whore?
I mean, the same deal with Penelope, right?
Yeah.
It's like, well, I'm just going to loom away, hide in my room. No one will expect me to do anything else because it's being chased.
Yeah.
And unachievable. Although I guess the unattainable woman is more of a medieval romance thing.
Well, anyway, they find Lucretia dutifully maintaining the loom and doing all the respectable things, and they're all awestruck at how hot this bitch is.
Her chastity is so hot.
Her chastity and her honor and all those other things.
Yeah.
All of the highest
Her
degree.
integrity.
Yes, and a sudden desire seized Sextus Tarquinius of having her for himself. So the next night, or later that night, he returns and forces himself upon her, and if she doesn't comply, he threatens to kill her and put a slave with her to make it look like some lover's suicide had gone on. It just completely ruined her reputation. So she finally gives in, and the next morning calls for her husband and father, and then, as any victim of suicide rape was expected back then, to save honor, to show that she did not in any way derive joy from that moment, she killed herself.
Mm-hmm.
It's not the fairest standard to set, but patriarchy and everything.
Right.
So she kills herself, and now all of a sudden, Collatinus is there, Lucretius, her father, and Brutus was just tagging along for some reason because these very personal moments you need the idiot, and all of a sudden he just shows off his intelligence and vows to avenge her, and that's how Livy has him ejecting the kings. But it seems obvious that there's a tradition where Collatinus, a consul of the following year, and Brutus are both responsible. But then the problem here is we don't actually. Funny thing, there's no evidence that predates 260 of the consulship existing.
Really?
Yes. It's largely believed to have existed for a century at least prior, but it's most likely there was some sort of role as Praetor Maximus or something that existed well before that, which gets glossed over.
Do you think the Spartan dyadic, reign, has some influence on that model?
I do not think so. I think that would have been too early still. The Romans probably had the consulship by the 4th century, but there was no evidence of the consulship existing before 260.
Mm-hmm.
Of actual direct evidence.
Right.
So I think it's the tomb or the sarcophagus of Lucius Scipio Ahenobarbus.
So we moved from a reign of tyrannical men who abuse power to a reign of old men who would also ultimately come to abuse power. Why don't you tell us about the Senate?
Well, the Senate has its origins, according to Livy.
Let's start with the etymology.
Oh, it's just the senatus, the body ruled by a senes, old man.
Right. So whenever you think of your Senate or your local senator, you're thinking of your local old white crusty man.
Yes. And I'd like to think that eventually the social situation evens out, so it just becomes old people. You can't. Young people.
No, you don't want to. I mean,
you need old people.
Yeah, you do. It's just that so many old people have been brainwashed into these bizarre worldviews.
I'd say white and crusty, and man can all go.
Crust. Yeah.
Yeah, actually, I think, say, when it comes to a deliberative body, a fair layer of crust might be a good thing.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't like the thin crust pizza, and
No. Nah, it's the same price as the regular pizza. I don't know why you wouldn't just go for more food.
Exactly, and I think the crust adds to the handle.
Mm-hmm. All right, so yeah, it's body of old men is the Senate, and when was it instituted? Was it instantaneous? Was it a process?
Well, it was, according to Livy, it was instituted with Romulus, but with 100, and then we get 200 later on with, I believe, Servius. Is it Tullius Servius or Servius Tullius? Servius Tullius, I believe. Okay. They would have changed the order anyway, talking.
Yeah.
So, yes, we get 200 expansion with the kings still. The second Etruscan king, Servius Tullius, precedes Tarquin the Proud.
Mm-hmm.
But, and he builds the Curia, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
But he's so many constitutional things are attributed to this one king that it seems like they
He's
have
like a Solon or a Lycurgus.
Yeah, except I'd say that's just that this becomes a character they have for a king, and all of a sudden everything that might have happened they just put to that person.
Oh, so he's their Midas.
Yes, and we also exactly we have 3 religious or civic kings and 4 expansionist kings.
Just the idea of like an archetype.
Yeah, exactly. He's following. Numa Pompilius was the religious archetype. Romulus was part civic with founding of the city, but then we have another civic archetype with...
Yeah, and the folk archetypes in Romulus, obviously.
Yeah.
Well, in all of these stories, there are like legend and folk and fairy tale and myth all kind of wound up together. They're not mutually exclusive to each other.
Yes, and if there's any truth to be found in any of them, we can't say.
Right.
The Romans regarded this to be true enough.
Yeah.
That Livy often says, "Who can know for certain?"
Yeah, that's a Whitehead dictum. He's like, but is it true? And he's like, well, it's true enough. That's all that matters. It's true enough as an operational model.
Like a lot of this stuff, like especially with the Regifugium happening in 509 or even as late as 510, like a lot of them draw parallels to Greek and what was happening in Athens specifically. So they say that like they made up a lot of these things just based on what was happening in Greece, and it must have been happening at the same time in Rome.
Yeah.
Is with the ejection of Aristogaton and Harmodius, Hippias, or is Hipparchus? I can never remember which one.
Oh, the 2 sons of...
Yeah, the Pisistratids.
Yeah.
So that was 509, and I've heard professors thinking that it was just because that happened in Greece then the Romans decided this could happen. So then you get like a lot of the stuff too with like Solon, where you have the archetypal lawgiver who did everything and set the city up. And you go back and you see Servius Tullius, who set up all the Gens. Maybe it was the Gens, wasn't it? Yeah.
These are the
he was responsible.
family clans?
Yeah, the 30. This was just the same number.
I believe the 30 was attributed to Romulus. Romulus is the 30 Curiae, never mind. That's attributed to him because Livy says this awesome line where this is not id non traditur, it's not handed down.
Yeah.
But then he goes on to say it. And that's pretty much acknowledging he has no source for this, and he's just reasoning it out of his head. That the 30 names for the Curiae, because there were obviously more than 30 Sabine women, maybe not, who knows how small it was, but came from the Sabine women, and there were disputes on whose name should be given to the Curiae.
Yeah. But like, just my point is that like with a period like that where you don't know anything for sure, it's really hard to ignore the parallels between what was happening in Athenian Greece and with the Romans.
Yes. I'm largely of the theory that the 509 date was given because the Roman historians looking back decided that, they did it at that time, we probably did too. That is, I am very much of that mind.
Yeah, so you think that because their Greek history was better than their own history, and they kind of just like drew parallels between the two?
Yeah, they just assumed that all things being equal, we probably did this at the same time. And there was probably a... I'm guessing the Regifugium in that capacity happened. It's just a matter of one war chief being expelled in place of another.
Yeah.
There are probably, from the looks of it, with various Etruscans who came later after the Tarquins to try to claim Rome in support of them, it's probably just evening out a story of various warlords either holding Rome or trying to hold Rome, and just a quick succession of rulers, that both external and internal, that Rome had in the 6th and 5th centuries.
Mm-hmm.
And this gets leveled out into... I've heard one historian, I forget his name, claim that all the names we have are true, and that it's just in the annals are actually all true. It's just they don't understand what the function was, and that the 5 consuls of 509, for example, all happened to all 5 of them happen to have just been successors of each other, whether through one expelling the other by violence.
Mm-hmm.
The problem with this is, I believe it was Gans who argued the stupidity of it, is it assumes that one warlord would dutifully put down to memory the name of man he just conquered.
Right. The damnatio memoriae is the more popular way to go.
Yeah, even then, this one doesn't require too much action. It just requires the failure to remember the deeds of your enemy.
Right.
Unless you need to remember the deeds. I mean, sometimes it comes in handy to say that you were able to defeat them, or to perhaps have some sort of collective trauma to share with your populace.
Mm-hmm.
But here it makes little sense in civic turmoil.
So, what can we say about this very early period of Rome in its relationship to the Mediterranean, or at least the Eastern Mediterranean at large? I mean, obviously, no contact with Egypt, very little, if any, contact with the Near East, perhaps a bit through Tyrian traders and things like that.
I would imagine no direct contact with
No. Okay.
the East. I bet that they'd get most of their
pottery
stuff.
from...
I'd bet they'd get most of that from Greek or Oscan or Etruscan sources or Carthaginian traders.
That's what I mean.
But they would. I doubt any direct Eastern traders would make it that far.
Okay.
So they'd see an intermediary. Ostia is fairly late. I believe that's attributed to Servius Tullius.
I don't know.
I believe Ostia is attributed to Servius Tullius.
Yeah, so Ostia is the port city of Rome, and it was gradually absorbed into Rome, essentially.
Yes, but it probably did not see anything more than just the odd merchant and the like.
Right.
And that would have probably been local merchants who wished to try their luck going further along the Italic coast.
So what about their interactions with nearby Greek colonies to the south?
We have very little knowledge about that, actually. There would have been the Oscans and the Umbrians and all that surrounding them, and the Etruscans. The direct contact with the Greeks doesn't happen until about the early 3rd century, after the Samnite Wars.
Mm-hmm.
Or at the tail end of the Samnite Wars.
Yeah, which we'll talk about sometime.
I mean, they claim to have, sent exact Tarquins going to Delphi, but...
Yeah.
Well, if you want to believe, when I was in Corinth, Guy Sanders, the head excavator, he claimed that all of the technology the Etruscans had came from the Corinthians.
That could very well be possible.
Very possible.
We were just discussing how the Etruscans came from one of the islands.
So
possibly
take that with a grain of salt.
I believe the Romans inherited a lot from the Greeks in the East indirectly.
You mean they didn't have alien technology?
Not as far as I know. Not yet, anyway. Hadn't landed.
They lied to me.
Yeah.
Remember, you only accuse non-white people of using alien technology. White people do it on their own innate genius.
Right. Everybody else, aliens.
Ancient aliens is the most racist thing ever.
I know, it is. What's great is that, I remember seeing somewhere on my Twitter feed, somebody had posted up, a mural from Egypt, and it was here is the, 18th dynasty pharaoh, so-and-so, fighting off the so-called aliens who were and they're like, this is very well, there's good records, they were Nubians or something like that. I mean, it wasn't that early, but hilarious. You're right. If it's not white, it's aliens.
Yeah. Or it's shitty.
Yeah, right.
Like
Or
if it's
savage and primitive.
if it looks advanced for its time or has anything noteworthy of it, and a white person didn't do it first, obviously there's some. Rather than just believe that white people aren't the be-all, end-all, something came from across the stars to help this one tribe over ours.
Too true. Okay, so what else? What about contact with, like, Transalpine Gaul?
Well, Transalpine Gaul, they did not actually start to get in contact with that until, like, the 3rd century.
Right.
Very limited. Like, they barely pushed beyond the borders of Latium until the 4th century.
Mm-hmm.
They were very isolated. It would have been a very rude awakening in the early 4th century when the Gauls came sweeping down and sacked the city. I mean, the Etruscans didn't fare much better.
Well, they hadn't moved very far north. With Veii was only 395.
It was
they were only
396 to 395.
Still dealing with the Etruscans at the beginning of the 4th century.
Yeah, they just captured one of their cities.
Oh, is this the story of the Invocatio of Juno?
Yeah.
You want to tell us about that?
Brett might be better suited.
You don't know it?
I know it, but
While Marcus Furius Camillus, attacking the walls of Veii, had no chance, he promised something to Juno. I think patrons.
Oh yeah, probably.
Yeah, to Juno if they could successfully siege the walls.
a tithe.
So Camillus and his forces were able to get through to Veii and burn it in the end. So that's how Juno got the prominent spot on the Capitoline Hill.
And they have a ritual called the Invocatio, where you essentially draw a deity out of the city and have it come and join your side. And this can be done physically once you sack the temple, and you literally take the statues, which are housed inside the temples, and bring them off as the spoils of war, respectfully nonetheless, and you enshrine them in your own temples. The Capitoline had a triad. It was Zeus,
Jupiter, Optus, Maximus, Juno, what was the epithet?
Moneta.
Moneta, yeah.
She'll get that in 6 years now.
Yeah.
Which is where money comes from.
Yeah, because it was the mint.
Yep.
So that's where mint comes from as well.
The highest temple, our money, which is something that so many people worship today, has, let's say, occult origins in religious back rooms.
Well, if you have a giant building and you're only storing a goddess in it, you have plenty of room.
That's true. And who was the third member of the triad?
Minerva.
Yeah, this was the perfect woman in accordance to man's understanding of what a perfect woman would be. Chaste and wise and warlike. Not necessarily. She's a man's lady. Clearly, she's not like a domestic woman's.
No.
Like, you're not going to find Minerva statues that domesticated women pray to. It's just there's no point for her.
Minerva has a very small role, I'd say, in Roman.
Yeah,
relative to her Greek counterpart. It's a lot less. You don't hear of her nearly as much.
Yeah. So
the fact that she
for those who don't know, Athens is the city of Athena, and Athena is the Greek counterpart to Minerva.
Yeah, but she has a very limited role in Roman literature, and nothing quite as big as the other two of the triad. Well, Jupiter goes without saying, as does Juno. She has far more domestic roles than Minerva. I mean,
Minerva has none.
She was important in the Etruscan religion.
She's sprung from the mind of Zeus, full in armor and ready for battle.
Well, her importance, I believe, is a relic of the Etruscan religion, and her name is Etruscan.
Oh, is it? Okay.
Yeah.
Minerva.
Cool.
I forget how it is pronounced, but I know it's Etruscan.
Is that like a digamma there?
Probably would have appeared as such.
Yeah.
Is Etruscan Slavic? Like linear B. Is it Slavic? Like Minerva?
The writing of it?
Yeah.
No, it's letters. So it's largely the question. Often the question is, did the Romans get their alphabet directly from Greeks or from Etruscans? Well, or Etruscans or whatever. probably Etruscans. But then again, did the Etruscans get their language from Greeks or Oscans?
It's funny that our alphabet is the Latin alphabet, and the Latin alphabet looks nothing like our alphabet.
Yeah. Oh,
Yeah. That's thanks to a lot of changes under the Carolingians.
Yeah.
bastards.
Well, they changed a lot. It was funny because later in the under Charlemagne, when he was reforming writing, they had all this messy shit, and they looked back and they looked at Roman capitals, and that's where they eventually got it from.
Yeah.
And Preconor, well, obviously.
Yeah, the minuscule is like much
Yeah.
Like,
Well,
like after the
Roman
Renaissance.
Roman cursive actually has a long tradition of looking like the minuscule.
Yes.
So
Well, that's what I'm saying. It's a classical throwback, following like in the Renaissance and after the Renaissance, and for print. But like, there's very little use of it around, let's say, Charlemagne's time.
Well, if I remember right, it's the Renaissance, like our modern alphabet comes from the Renaissance guys who thought that a reformed alphabet from the Middle Ages was actually Latin alphabet. So that's what they ended up going with, because they thought it was older than it was.
Yeah, that is I think a tradition.
of getting history wrong and
Yeah, people thinking things. I talked earlier, I think last session, about Hermeticism and how people often retro-project Hermeticism to like, it's Hermes Trismegistus was contemporaneous with Moses, and it is the like Prisca Theologica, and it is like the most ancient religion, and all religions stem from it, and its texts were, you know, penned at the same time as Moses was penning the book of Genesis. And then Renaissance philologists looked at it and they were just like, no, it's 2nd century AD. Like, it's got like Stoicism here, it's got Platonism here, it's got like
oh, good old philology.
yeah, and they ruined the fun for everyone. Well, I don't know, to me it doesn't.
It doesn't. Yeah,
It
the
makes-
argument's the same.
It makes, I'm like, a truth is truth. It doesn't matter how, you know, when it was written. In fact, to me, that something be in the axial age is of more importance than it being ancient.
Yeah.
Because people had to lose their humanity for a while before teachers could come to teach people to regain their humanity. Because that's essentially, I mean, every great culture had these teachers come at a very specific time between the like 6th and like 2nd centuries AD, 6th century BC to the 2nd century AD, to get people back on track, because things like slavery are out of hand. Although, surprisingly, Jesus never mentions slavery.
Well, he talks about slaves, but never slavery.
Be a good slave if you're a slave, and be a good master if you're a good master. Ideally, that would work, but it's interesting that like Christianity would become a religion so enshrined by slaves and marginalized women, and yet their savior has nothing to say about slavery or like.
Yeah.
You know what I think is funny is actually how Geoffrey of Monmouth, when he wrote the Historia Regum Britanniae, he piggybacked on the story of Aeneas, because he says that the first kings of England in the first book was Brutus.
Everyone does that.
I think it's
Everyone,
hilarious.
every king of Europe ever claims
Yeah.
Trojan origin.
The banished son of
I gotta go
Aeneas
let-
Brutus, great grandson of Aeneas Brutus, banished, wanders, ends up in England, becomes the king. I always thought that was really funny.
Nice.